The email came in at 6:12 on a Tuesday while I was pouring cereal into a bowl before work. I almost deleted it because the subject line looked like one of those boring account notices nobody ever reads. Then I saw the words, "Ownership records have been updated." It was from the title company that handled the paperwork on my lake cabin. The little cabin wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms. A wraparound porch. My grandmother left it to me 5 years earlier with one request: promise me nobody talks you into selling it. I clicked the attachment expecting some kind of annual notice. Instead, I found a deed with my name crossed out and someone else's typed underneath. My parents. According to the document, I had supposedly signed the transfer 3 weeks earlier. I hadn't even been in town 3 weeks earlier. I was in Chicago at a medical conference with hundreds of coworkers who could prove exactly where I was. I called my mother before I called anyone else. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting beside the phone. Before I could finish my sentence, my father took the phone and said quietly, "Don't panic. We already handled everything. It's still staying in the family." I should have hung up the second he said that. Looking back, that was the moment I knew this wasn't some paperwork mistake. My father never said, "We handled everything," unless he had already decided the conversation was over. I asked him what he meant. There was a long pause, and then my mother spoke again, calm as ever. "Honey, you've been so busy. You hardly use the cabin anymore. Your father and I thought it was smarter to put it where the family could manage it together." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone while my cereal slowly turned to mush. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had even mentioned changing the deed. That cabin wasn't an investment property to me. It was where my grandmother taught me how to fish, where she showed me how to bake peach cobbler, where she wrote my name inside the first book she ever gave me. Every room smelled like cedar and old coffee. Every scratch in the wooden floor had a story behind it. I finally asked the only question that mattered. "How did you transfer property I never agreed to sell?" My father didn't hesitate. "Everything was signed legally." Then he added one sentence that made me grab my car keys before the call even ended. "You won't be able to change it now." I threw my laptop into my work bag, grabbed the folder where I kept every document my grandmother had ever given me, and drove straight to the county recorder's office instead of going to the hospital. I called my supervisor on the way and told her there was a family emergency. She didn't ask questions. She just told me to take whatever time I needed. During the 40-minute drive, I kept replaying that phone call in my head. My parents hadn't sounded nervous. They hadn't sounded guilty. They sounded finished, like they believed there was nothing I could do. That bothered me more than anything else. My father was an accountant for almost 30 years. He wasn't careless with paperwork. If he was acting this confident, he believed every signature, every stamp, and every page would survive a challenge. That meant someone had spent time putting this together. When I reached the recorder's office, the clerk looked up the property in less than 2 minutes. She turned her monitor toward me and quietly said, "The transfer was recorded 19 days ago." My stomach dropped. There it was. My grandmother's cabin. New owners, my parents, listed as joint tenants with full ownership rights. The transfer document included my signature, a notary seal, and 2 witness signatures. I stared at my own name for several seconds before saying, "I didn't sign this." The clerk didn't argue. She simply asked if I wanted certified copies. I said yes. While the printer ran, I looked closer at the paperwork. The signature looked close enough that a stranger might believe it, but I saw the mistake immediately. I always signed my last name with one continuous line between the last 2 letters because my grandmother had taught me that little flourish when I opened my first checking account at 18. Whoever copied my signature lifted the pen halfway through. It was small, but it wasn't mine. Then I noticed something else. According to the document, the signing happened on a Friday afternoon at 3:15. I smiled for the first time all morning because I knew exactly where I had been at 3:15 that Friday. I had been speaking on a hospital panel about patient safety. More than 200 nurses and physicians were sitting in that auditorium. There were photographs online, attendance records, and even a live stream the hospital had archived. I couldn't have been signing paperwork in another county at the exact same time. I asked the clerk if she could tell me who notarized the document. She pointed to the seal. The notary worked at a small shipping and business center across town. I thanked her, tucked the certified copies into my folder, and drove there without calling my parents back. The owner of the shop greeted me with a smile until I placed the deed on the counter. His expression changed immediately. He studied the notary stamp, then walked into a back office for almost 5 minutes. When he returned, he carried a logbook. He flipped through several pages before stopping on the date listed on the deed. Then he frowned. "That's strange," he said softly. "The log shows our notary was on vacation that entire week. She was in Arizona visiting her daughter." He looked at the signature in the logbook and then back at the document I had handed him. "She couldn't have notarized this." My phone started vibrating across the counter. Mom. Then Dad. Then Mom again. I silenced every call. The owner closed the logbook, looked directly at me, and said, "Ma'am, if this document was recorded with a fake notarization, you need an attorney today, and probably the sheriff too." At that moment, I stopped wondering whether my parents had made a terrible mistake. I started wondering how many people had helped them do it. I walked out to my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute with the certified deed on my lap. My phone had 23 missed calls by then. 12 from my mother. 8 from my father. 3 from my older brother, Ethan. Ethan never called me during work hours unless someone was in the hospital, so I answered. Before I could say hello, he sighed and said, "Please don't make this bigger than it has to be." I asked him one question. "Did you know?" There was silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Just silence. Finally, he said, "Mom and Dad thought it would be easier if the cabin stayed under their names. They were only trying to keep it in the family." I looked through the windshield at the parking lot and laughed once. It wasn't because anything was funny. It was because I had just realized something. The cabin had never been leaving the family. I wasn't selling it. I wasn't renting it. I paid the taxes every year. I paid for the roof after a storm damaged it. I replaced the old plumbing. I even drove there every spring to repaint the porch myself because my grandmother loved that pale blue color. The only people talking about taking the cabin away were the people who had just stolen it. I asked Ethan, "Who came up with this?" He answered too quickly. "I don't know." Then he corrected himself. "I mean, everybody talked about it." Everybody. That one word told me this wasn't my parents acting alone over a weekend. This had been discussed around dinner tables while I wasn't there. Someone had planned it. Someone had decided I wouldn't fight back. I ended the call without another word and drove straight to the office of the real estate attorney who had handled my grandmother's estate years earlier. I wasn't sure he'd even remember me, but when I walked into his office carrying the folder my grandmother had given me, he looked up, smiled, and said, "Emma. I haven't seen you since your grandmother's probate hearing." His name was Mr. Carter. He had gray hair now, but he still spoke in the same calm voice I remembered. I laid the certified deed in front of him and simply said, "I think someone stole my property." He spent almost 15 minutes reading every page without interrupting me. Then he asked one question that caught me off guard. "Did your grandmother ever tell you why she insisted on leaving this cabin directly to you instead of your parents?" I nodded slowly. "She said they always saw property as money. She wanted me to see it as home." Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your grandmother also left me a sealed letter. She instructed me not to open it unless ownership of the cabin was ever challenged by family." I stared at him. I had never heard about any letter. He unlocked a filing cabinet behind his desk, removed a thick envelope with my grandmother's handwriting across the front, and carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten note and several photocopies. He read silently for a moment before sliding everything toward me. The first page was a letter from my grandmother explaining that she believed my parents would eventually try to pressure me into giving up the cabin because they had repeatedly asked her to transfer it before she died. The remaining pages shocked me even more. They were copies of letters my parents had written to her years earlier asking her to change her will so the cabin could become shared family property. She had refused every request. At the bottom of her letter she had written one sentence in blue ink: "If you're reading this, they finally tried anyway." My eyes stayed on those words while the room went completely quiet. Mr. Carter broke the silence. "Emma, this doesn't just help explain motive. It establishes a history. Your grandmother anticipated exactly this situation." He picked up the forged deed again and looked at the fake notarization. "I'm going to call the county fraud investigator myself." Before he could reach for the phone, my mother walked through the office door without knocking, smiled at the receptionist as if she belonged there, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "There you are. Sweetheart, you've completely misunderstood what happened." Every conversation in the office stopped. My mother stood in the doorway wearing a beige cardigan and carrying the leather purse she always brought to church, the one she used whenever she wanted to look respectable. My father walked in behind her with a thin manila folder tucked under his arm. Neither of them looked surprised to see me there. That meant someone had told them where I was. My first thought was Ethan. Mr. Carter stood up before either of them could come farther into the office. "Can I help you?" he asked. My mother smiled politely. "I'm Emma's mother. We're just here to clear up a family misunderstanding." She said it loud enough for the receptionist to hear, as if she wanted an audience. I stayed in my chair. I didn't answer her. I remembered something my grandmother used to say whenever my parents started arguing with neighbors over the smallest things. The first person who starts performing usually knows they're losing. My father stepped forward and placed the manila folder on Mr. Carter's desk. "We have copies of the transfer documents. Everything was signed voluntarily. Emma has simply forgotten some conversations because she's been under a lot of pressure at work." I looked at him and asked, "Are you saying I signed those papers?" He nodded without hesitation. "You did." "Where?" I asked. "At our house," he answered. "When?" 3 weeks ago." I slid the hospital conference schedule across the desk. It showed my name as a keynote speaker at exactly the same time the deed claimed I was signing papers in another county. Mr. Carter quietly placed the schedule beside the forged deed without saying a word. My father's expression didn't change, but I noticed him swallow once. My mother stepped in before he could answer. "Honey, those conference times aren't always exact." I almost laughed. She wasn't denying the evidence. She was trying to make it sound flexible. Mr. Carter finally spoke. "Mrs. Collins, the document says your daughter appeared before a notary at 3:15 p.m. in Brookfield. Hospital records place her over 90 miles away speaking live to more than 200 attendees at that exact time." My mother's smile faded for the first time. She looked at me instead of him. "Emma, are you really trying to embarrass your own parents?" There it was. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just guilt. The same tool she'd used my whole life whenever she wanted me to stop asking questions. I didn't take the bait. I reached into my folder and placed the copy of the notary log on the desk. The notary whose seal appears on this deed was in Arizona that entire week. Nobody spoke. My father slowly opened his folder, looked through several papers, then closed it again without taking anything out. It was the smallest movement, but it told me everything. Whatever he thought was inside wasn't there. Mr. Carter pressed the intercom button on his desk and calmly asked his assistant to contact the county fraud investigator and request immediate assistance. My mother heard every word. Her face changed instantly. The soft concern disappeared, replaced by sharp frustration. "You're calling the government over family business?" she snapped. Mr. Carter answered without raising his voice. "No, ma'am. I'm reporting what appears to be a forged property transfer. My father finally spoke again, but this time he wasn't calm. Emma, if you do this, there won't be any coming back from it. I looked straight at him. You crossed that line when you filed a deed with my fake signature. The room went silent again. About 20 minutes later, 2 investigators from the county property fraud unit arrived. They introduced themselves, collected copies of every document, photographed the original deed, and asked each of us to remain available for separate interviews. One investigator compared my driver's license signature with the signature on the deed for less than 30 seconds before looking at his partner and quietly saying, "These aren't even written the same way." My mother interrupted immediately. "She's nervous today. Her signature changes when she's emotional." The investigator didn't even look at her. He simply wrote something in his notebook. Then he asked my parents one simple question. "Can either of you tell us who prepared this deed?" My mother answered, "A document service." My father answered at almost the same time, "Our financial advisor recommended someone." The investigators looked at each other. Neither of them said a word. They just kept writing. And for the first time that day, I saw uncertainty replace confidence on my parents' faces. The investigators asked Mr. Carter if they could use his conference room to conduct separate interviews, and he agreed immediately. They took my parents into different rooms without letting them speak to each other first. I stayed where I was, sipping cold coffee the receptionist had quietly placed beside me. About 15 minutes later, one of the investigators returned and asked if I had any proof that I had been out of town on the day listed on the deed besides the conference schedule. I opened my phone and showed him the photos from the event, the livestream link, my hotel receipt, parking records, and even the email confirming I had checked into the conference that morning. He nodded and smiled slightly. "This is exactly the kind of timeline we need." Then he asked one more question. "Did anyone besides your parents have a reason to benefit from owning the cabin?" I didn't hesitate. "My brother." I explained how Ethan had been trying to convince everyone for years that the cabin should be sold because the land had become valuable. A new luxury resort was being built less than 2 miles away, and property prices around the lake had nearly doubled in the last 18 months. My grandmother had refused every offer while she was alive. She used to say, "Once this land is gone, it's gone forever." The investigator wrote that down. Less than 10 minutes later, another investigator walked out of the interview room holding my father's phone inside a clear evidence bag. My father immediately stood up and protested, saying they had no right to take it, but the investigator calmly explained that he had voluntarily handed it over after claiming it contained messages proving I had agreed to the transfer. That confidence lasted about 30 seconds. The investigator connected the phone to a forensic device in front of everyone. Instead of messages from me approving the transfer, they found a group chat created 6 weeks earlier. The participants were my father, my mother, Ethan, and Ethan's wife. The first message they opened was from Ethan: "If Emma won't sell it, we need another way before the developer buys the property next door." Another message from my mother read, "She'll never call the police on family." Then my father replied, "Leave the paperwork to me." Nobody in the room spoke. The investigators kept scrolling. There were discussions about finding blank deed templates, comparing examples of my signature from old birthday cards, and arguing over whether the transfer should happen before or after the developer announced the final purchase price for the neighboring land. Then came the message that made my stomach turn. Ethan had written, "Once Mom and Dad own it, we'll convince Emma to let it go. She'll eventually forgive us after she gets her share." My share. They had already divided property that wasn't theirs. They weren't trying to protect my grandmother's cabin. They were trying to sell it. One investigator quietly photographed every message while the other asked my parents if they wished to change any of their earlier statements. Neither answered. About 20 minutes later, Ethan walked into the office looking annoyed instead of worried. The moment he saw the investigators, the evidence bags, and our parents sitting in separate rooms, his expression completely changed. He looked at me and said, "Emma, this isn't what you think." I almost smiled because that sentence always comes after people realize the truth has already caught up with them. One investigator walked over and asked, "Sir, are you Ethan Collins?" He nodded. "We'll need to speak with you as well." Ethan looked toward our parents for help, but neither of them could even meet his eyes. The group that had sounded so confident on the phone that morning suddenly couldn't keep a single story straight. As the investigator escorted Ethan into another room, Mr. Carter quietly placed my grandmother's handwritten letter back into its envelope and slid it across the table to me. "She hoped you'd never have to read this," he said softly. I held the envelope in my hands and realized my grandmother had protected me one final time. She couldn't stop them from trying to steal the cabin after she was gone. But she had made sure they wouldn't get away with it. The investigation lasted a little over 10 months. During that time, every document was examined, every signature was analyzed, and every message was recovered. The county eventually proved that the deed had been created using a template downloaded online, that the notary seal had been copied from an old public filing, and that my parents and brother had coordinated the entire transfer weeks before it was recorded. The ownership change was voided. The cabin was returned to me. Criminal charges followed. I won't spend time listing every sentence or every court date because, honestly, the most important moment happened long before the verdict. It happened the day I stopped trying to convince people who knew the truth to admit it. Once I focused on facts instead of arguments, everything became simpler. The evidence did the talking. My grandmother's cabin still sits beside the lake today. The porch is still painted pale blue. Her books are still on the shelf. Every summer, I sit on that porch with a cup of coffee and watch the water the same way she used to. Sometimes protecting what belongs to you isn't about money. Sometimes it's about refusing to let someone rewrite a story that was never theirs to own in the first place. If this story stayed with you, let me know where you were when you realized someone you trusted wasn't being honest, and don't forget to subscribe for more true emotional stories.